Welcome, friends. Come on in, get comfortable, and let the evening settle around you. Whether you're curled beneath a warm blanket, resting your head against a familiar pillow, or simply letting the last thoughts of the day grow quieter, I am glad you are here. Perhaps there is only a soft lamp beside you. Perhaps moonlight lies pale across the floor, or perhaps the room is already almost dark. Whatever the hour, let the noise beyond the walls fade for a little while. So, before we begin, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy these journeys into the past, and let me know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is where you are. Now breathe slowly and allow the present to loosen its hold. Tonight, we are stepping back into the 18th century, into a world of manor houses and market squares, muddy roads, winter fields, and church bells measuring out the day. It is a world that can seem distant, though many of its worries would feel strangely familiar. This story begins not with a battle, coronation, or scandal at court, but with a quieter question: what became of the women who never married? In the 1700s, marriage was not simply a private matter of affection. It was often treated as the expected shape of a woman's life, the doorway through which she passed from her father's household into her husband's. Parish registers, family letters, wills, household accounts, and the occasional diary preserve fragments of these lives, though no one can quite agree how fully those fragments reveal the truth. Women who remained unmarried often appear only briefly in surviving records. A name beside a baptism, a signature on a receipt, a bequest of linen, a complaint before a manor court, or a small payment for nursing the sick. The language used for them could be plain, and sometimes cruel. The word spinster, which had once described a woman who spun thread for a living, gradually became a legal and social label for an unmarried woman. It carried different meanings depending on place, class, and circumstance. A prosperous merchant's daughter who remained single might be called independent, dutiful, or particular. A poor labourer's daughter might be judged burdensome, unfortunate, or suspicious. Some chroniclers claimed unmarried women were naturally melancholy. Others praised them as useful daughters, careful housekeepers, devoted aunts, or pious neighbours. The reality was much less tidy. Their lives unfolded beneath the same roofs and weather as everyone else's. In a country house, rush matting or worn boards softened the chill of the floor, while beeswax candles burned in the best rooms and cheaper tallow candles smoked in servants' quarters. In cottages, wool blankets were precious. Bread might be stretched with oats or barley, and a pot of pottage could simmer beside the hearth from one day into the next. Unmarried women carried water, mended clothing, salted meat, brewed small ale, watched children, tended kitchen gardens, and sat late with needles flashing faintly in firelight. Their days were rarely empty, even when the world insisted their lives were incomplete. Marriage remained the ideal partly because it organised property, labour, inheritance, and social standing. A husband might provide a household, income, protection, and a recognised place in the community. Yet marriage could also remove legal independence, under the principle known as coverture in England. A married woman's legal identity was largely absorbed into that of her husband. An unmarried woman, by contrast, could sometimes sign contracts, earn wages, hold property, make a will, or bring a complaint before a court in her own name. This did not mean freedom in any modern sense. Poverty, family pressure, reputation, and local custom could narrow her choices severely. Still, the unmarried state sometimes preserved a small space of control that marriage might have taken away. Some women never married because no suitable match appeared. Wars, migration, dangerous trades, disease, and uneven local populations could leave communities with fewer men of marriageable age. Others lacked dowries. A family might need every coin for a son's apprenticeship, a rent payment, or younger children. Some women cared for aging parents and remained at home until the years of expected courtship had quietly passed. A few rejected marriage deliberately, though surviving evidence is thin, and historians continue to debate how often this happened. Silence in the records can conceal both choice and coercion. There were also women whose engagements failed, whose sweethearts died, whose reputations were damaged by rumour, or whose families forbade a match. In villages where news travelled faster than carts along the lane, a broken promise might remain remembered for decades. A woman could be watched closely at church, at the well, or in the market. Small customs mattered. A sprig of rosemary might be carried for remembrance. A ribbon exchanged at a fair could signal favour. A dream on certain saints' nights might be interpreted as a glimpse of a future husband. Some young women placed herbs beneath their pillows, hoping for a revealing dream. Whether they believed the charm or simply enjoyed the secrecy is impossible to know. Beyond the windows, the evening world moved slowly. Wind passed through bare branches. A cart creaked toward the village inn. Across damp fields, bells sounded from a stone church, their notes spreading over hedges and frozen ruts before fading into darkness. Inside, a woman who had never married might still be finishing the day's work, folding linen into an oak chest, banking the fire, or checking the latch on a heavy door. To imagine her life clearly, it helps to set aside the notion that she belonged to one category. She might be wealthy or destitute, admired or mocked, deeply religious or quietly skeptical, surrounded by kin or entirely alone. She might manage a shop, milk cows before dawn, keep accounts for a brother, nurse neighbours through fever, or spend years as a paid companion in someone else's house. She might long for marriage, fear it, regret missing it, or feel relieved that it never came. What united these women was not one shared destiny, but the need to build lives beside an institution that society treated as nearly universal. Their hidden history survives in ordinary things: a worn key, a recipe book, a widow's spare room, a market stall, a bundle of letters tied with thread. Through such small traces, their world begins to brighten for a moment, like a candle newly lit in a quiet hall. A girl born beneath the roof of a manor house, a farmhouse, or a narrow town dwelling entered a world in which her future was discussed long before she was old enough to understand it. Her family might speak of marriage in practical tones, as they spoke of rents, harvests, apprenticeships, and debts. Somewhere beyond childhood waited another household, another name, and a husband whose character could not yet be known. Until that day arrived, she would be trained to become useful, obedient, watchful and prepared. Her earliest lessons were often learned beside the hearth. She watched older women knead bread, skim cream, season pottage, preserve fruit, count linen, and judge whether meat had been sufficiently salted for winter. In wealthier households, servants performed much of the heavy labour, but daughters were still expected to understand the hidden machinery of domestic life. A household could consume astonishing quantities of candles, flour, soap, ale, cloth, and firewood, and a competent mistress was supposed to know when supplies were being wasted or quietly stolen. There were few moments entirely free from instruction. A child might sit on a low stool near the kitchen fire, twisting wool between small fingers while her mother inspected a seam. She learned how to keep moths from stored cloth with dried lavender or rosemary, how to air blankets after damp weather, and how to recognize the bitter smell of tallow smoke when a candle wick required trimming. Some families placed bay leaves in chests to protect linen, while others trusted stronger-smelling herbs or small charms whose origins were already ancient. No one can quite agree how seriously such household protections were believed, but customs often continued long after their meaning had grown uncertain. Girls in comfortable homes might learn reading, writing, music, drawing, and polite conversation. Education, however, was usually shaped around usefulness and social expectation. A daughter might read scripture fluently while receiving little instruction in law or business. She might write a graceful letter but remain excluded from the deeper financial discussions taking place at the dining table. Yet there were exceptions. Merchant families sometimes trained daughters to keep accounts, calculate prices, and understand trade because illness or travel could leave women responsible for shops and warehouses. Surviving account books reveal neat female handwriting beside columns of grain, candles, ribbons, and unpaid debts. In poorer households, education came through repetition rather than books. Girls gathered kindling, watched younger children, drove geese from gardens, carried water, cleaned pots with sand, and helped spread fresh rushes or straw over worn floors. A dropped pitcher or scorched loaf might bring sharp correction, for fragile objects and wasted food were serious matters. Their labour was essential. Childhood could be affectionate, but it was rarely protected from responsibility for long. The rhythm of the day was marked by bells. Church bells called the parish to worship, announced deaths, warned of fire, and measured hours for those without clocks. At dawn, a girl might wake beneath a wool blanket in a room shared with sisters, cousins, or servants. Frost gathered inside the window glass during hard winters, and wash water could be painfully cold. By evening, the family returned to candlelight, worn wooden chairs, and the low murmur of work performed by hand. As she grew older, her clothing changed subtly, and so did the way others looked at her. Her behaviour became connected to family reputation. She was expected to avoid situations that could encourage gossip, for gossip could damage marriage prospects more effectively than poverty. A young woman seen lingering alone with a man, laughing too freely at an inn, or returning late from a fair might become the subject of whispers. Whether the incident was innocent mattered less than whether neighbours believed it to be. Courtship was often supervised, though supervision varied greatly. In some households, young people met at church, seasonal dances, markets, harvest gatherings, or while visiting neighbouring families. Mothers, aunts, and married sisters observed these meetings carefully. A glance held too long, a ribbon accepted, or repeated conversation after worship might be noticed. Some young women consulted fortune-telling customs, dropping melted wax into water or counting apple seeds while reciting names. Clergymen might condemn such practices, yet they survived in kitchens and bedchambers, passed quietly from one generation to the next. Behind these rituals stood the harder matter of property. Inheritance customs shaped the futures of daughters as surely as affection did. Land commonly passed to sons, especially the eldest. Though customs differed by region and class, daughters might receive dowries, household goods, clothing, money, livestock, or smaller portions of an estate. A chest of linen, a feather bed, brass cookware, and several silver spoons could represent years of careful preparation. A dowry was not merely a gift. It could determine whether a marriage was possible. Families negotiated over sums, property, and expectations, sometimes with a coldness that left little room for romance. A daughter with money attracted more suitors than one without it, though wealth offered no guarantee of kindness. Some fathers delayed marriages while attempting to improve a settlement. Others arranged matches that strengthened business ties or joined neighbouring properties. Those who recorded such negotiations rarely described what the young women felt. The pressure was often quiet rather than openly cruel. A daughter might hear that her younger sister could not marry until she did, She might be reminded that her father could not support her forever, or that a promising man should not be refused merely because he was older, stern, or unfamiliar. Mothers sometimes urge caution, knowing from experience how difficult marriage could become. At other times, they press daughters toward security, fearing the greater dangers of poverty and dependence. For a woman without brothers, inheritance could be more complicated. She might become an heiress, making her valuable in the marriage market while also attracting men interested primarily in her property. Legal settlements could be created to protect part of her wealth, but such arrangements depended on knowledgeable relatives and skilled lawyers. A poorly written agreement might leave everything under a husband's control. Girls understood these realities gradually. They absorbed them through overheard conversations, visiting relatives, weddings, funerals, and the distribution of possessions after a death. They saw married sisters depart in carts carrying trunks, bedding, and carefully wrapped dishes. They also saw unmarried aunts remain behind, useful within the family yet uncertain of their permanent place. On winter evenings, when rain touched the roof and the fire settled into red embers, a mother might open an oak chest and unfold the linen being saved for her daughter. Each sheet had been spun, woven, washed, and mended with patience. The chest carried hope, duty, and calculation together. It was a promise of a household not yet formed, and a reminder that the expected road ahead had already been chosen in outline. Still, not every daughter followed it. Some lacked the necessary portion, some refused the suitors presented to them, some remained too deeply tied to parents or siblings to leave. Others waited for affection and discovered that time, quietly and without malice, had moved beyond the years when neighbours expected a proposal. Their unmarried lives did not begin suddenly. They grew from countless small decisions made beneath familiar roofs. While bells sounded across the fields and candle flames trembled in the evening air. By the time a young woman reached the age at which neighbours began to watch her prospects with interest, the road toward marriage had already narrowed around her. It was not a single gate standing plainly before her, but a succession of small passages shaped by family income, local custom, personal reputation, health, appearance, religion, and chance. Some women moved through them easily. Others found one passage closed, then another, until the expected future became uncertain. Courtship in the 18th century could be formal or surprisingly ordinary. A young man might first notice a woman at church, where families sat in familiar pews and every movement could be observed. He might see her at a market, a harvest supper, a winter dance, or while passing between neighbouring farms. In villages, courtship rarely unfolded in complete privacy. Sisters, cousins, servants, and elderly relatives carried news from one household to another, and a conversation beside a churchyard wall might become common knowledge before evening. Among prosperous families, introductions were often arranged through kin or trusted acquaintances. Visits were made under supervision, tea was poured, cards were played, and polite questions concealed practical calculation. A suitor's income, family connections, debts, habits, and prospects mattered as much as his manners. A daughter's dowry, health, domestic ability, and reputation were considered in return. Affection might grow within these arrangements, but it was expected to coexist with prudence. In humbler households, courtship could happen during work. A farm servant might walk beside a labourer returning from the fields. A dairymaid might exchange words with a carter at the gate. Young people met while carrying produce to market, gathering fuel, helping at harvest, or attending seasonal fairs. Sunday evenings offered rare leisure, though even then the village remained attentive. A young man who visited too often could be accused of wasting a household's candles and firewood, a complaint that was practical as well as moral. Tokens of affection were usually small: a ribbon, a carved wooden comb, A handkerchief or a cheap printed verse might pass between two people. Some men offered love spoons decorated with hearts, chains, or wheels, while others gave coins bent into symbolic shapes. A woman might return a token if she wished to discourage attention, though the meaning of such gestures varied. Those who later recorded these customs never fully agreed on which signs indicated a promise and which were merely flirtation. Folk belief surrounded courtship, especially on certain nights of the year. A young woman might place rosemary beneath her pillow, peel an apple in one long strip and throw it over her shoulder, or gaze into a candlelit mirror hoping to glimpse the outline of a future husband. In some places, unmarried girls listened for dogs barking after midnight, believing the direction of the sound revealed where a suitor would come from. Clergymen discouraged such practices, but old customs often survived quietly beside official religion. More serious than any charm was the question of settlement. Before a marriage among families with property, negotiations might continue for weeks or months. Lawyers drafted agreements concerning land, money, household goods, and support in widowhood. A father might promise a fixed sum, livestock, or income from rents. A groom's family might guarantee a jointure, providing for the bride if she outlived her husband. Every clause mattered, because a woman's future security could depend on words written by men around a table she was not invited to join. Among poorer families there might be no formal contract, but property still mattered. A bride could bring bedding, linen, cooking vessels, clothing, a cow, or a small amount of saved money. These objects represented labour accumulated over years. A feather bed was valuable. So were pewter plates, iron pots, and strong wool blankets. A woman who possessed little might still be admired, but admiration did not always overcome the fear of supporting another person. Marriage required more than two willing individuals. Families could obstruct a match they considered unsuitable. A servant might need permission from an employer before marrying, particularly if the marriage meant leaving service. A parish might resist a union if it feared the couple would become dependent on poor relief. Under settlement laws in England, responsibility for the poor belonged to particular parishes, and local officials sometimes examined newcomers with suspicion. Love could therefore become entangled with questions of residency, wages, and who would pay if illness or hunger came. Reputation remained fragile. A rumour of sexual misconduct could damage a woman's prospects far more severely than a man's. Pregnancy outside marriage carried heavy social and economic consequences, but even an accusation without proof could linger. A woman who was considered loud, quarrelsome, idle, extravagant, or too familiar with men might be judged unsuitable. The same community that praised cheerfulness in one woman might condemn it as boldness in another. Yet excessive reserve could also be criticised. A woman who refused several suitors might be called proud or difficult. If she accepted too quickly, she risked appearing eager. If she waited, she might be warned that youth was passing. There was no perfect manner of navigating these expectations. The narrow gate shifted according to who was watching. Some engagements ended because money failed to appear. A promised dowry might be reduced after a bad harvest, a lawsuit, or a father's death. A suitor might discover debts in the prospective bride's family and withdraw. Others left for military service, sea voyages, colonial work, or distant apprenticeships and never returned. Letters were lost, illness came suddenly, smallpox, fever, accidents, and childbirth deaths shaped the marriage market in ways no family could fully predict. At dusk, roads between villages grew dark quickly. A young man visiting a household might leave before the lanes became dangerous, carrying a lantern whose flame wavered behind horn panels. Inside, the woman he had called upon might sit near the hearth, while her family quietly assessed the meeting. Outside, Rain gathered in ruts, and bells sounded from the church tower across fields already hidden in mist. Some women remained unmarried because the men they loved died. Some were abandoned after long promises. Others rejected matches that seemed unsafe, humiliating, or simply unbearable. A few may have preferred the independence of single life, though surviving documents rarely allow certainty. Historians continue to debate how often unmarried women made deliberate choices and how often circumstance chose for them. There were women whose health made marriage less likely, women considered too poor, women burdened by family care, and women whose appearance was discussed with the casual cruelty of neighbours. There were also women who received proposals and quietly said no. Their reasons might never have been recorded. Perhaps they feared a man's temper. Perhaps they had seen too much of unhappy marriage. Perhaps they valued the room, wages, or small legal authority they possessed while single. The marriage market was therefore not a cheerful parade of dances and proposals. It was a careful negotiation conducted beneath candlelight, beside market stalls, and across kitchen tables. It held affection, hope, calculation, fear, and silence in equal measure. For those who passed through its gate, another household waited. For those who did not, life continued along less celebrated paths, through village lanes, workrooms, fields, and rooms where no wedding chest was ever opened. Beyond the uncertain gate of marriage, village life continued with little ceremony. A woman who remained unmarried still woke to bells, weather, work, and the needs of others. She did not step outside society simply because no husband's name appeared beside hers in the parish register. Instead, she occupied a position that could be useful, respected, pitied, or mistrusted, sometimes all within the same week. In rural communities, almost every pair of capable hands mattered. Fields had to be gleaned after harvest, cows milked before sunrise, bread mixed, wool carded, clothes mended, and children watched while their mothers worked. An unmarried woman might remain in her parents' cottage, contributing labour in exchange for food and shelter. She might live with a married brother, keep house for a widowed father, or move between relatives as illness and necessity required. Her place was rarely secure in a legal sense, yet her usefulness could make her indispensable. The village knew who could be relied upon. There was often one woman summoned when a child developed a fever, another who sat beside the dying, and another who understood how to stretch a small quantity of flour through a difficult winter. An unmarried aunt might care for several generations of nieces and nephews, remembering births, illnesses, quarrels, and promises long after others had forgotten them. Such women carried family memory without being granted much public recognition for it. Respect was usually earned slowly. A woman who worked hard, attended church, avoided public disputes, and helped neighbours in times of sickness might become a trusted figure. She could be asked to witness agreements, prepare a body for burial, or stand as godmother at a baptism. In some parishes, godparenthood created obligations that extended well beyond the church ceremony. A godmother might provide a small coin, a cap, a spoon, or assistance during hardship. No one can quite agree how faithfully these duties were observed, but the relationship could give an unmarried woman a recognised place within a family not her own. Village work was governed by season. In spring, women planted kitchen gardens with onions, cabbages, peas, and medicinal herbs. Summer brought haymaking, dairying, and long daylight hours. Autumn meant preserving fruit, drying beans, salting meat, and gathering fuel. In winter, much of life contracted toward the hearth. Wool was spun, stockings darned, baskets repaired, and stories passed quietly through rooms darkened by soot. An unmarried woman might earn a few coins by spinning flax or wool. The work was repetitive and poorly paid, but it could be carried out near the fire or while watching children. The spindle and distaff were so closely associated with female labour that the legal term spinster grew from the occupation itself. Yet not every unmarried woman spun, and not every spinner was single. Language simplified lives that were far more varied. Others brewed ale, baked bread for sale, washed linen, raised poultry, or carried eggs and butter to market. A woman with access to a small plot might keep bees, though beekeeping was surrounded by unusual customs. In some districts, bees were told when someone in the household died, and a strip of mourning cloth might be tied near the hive. People feared that bees neglected during a death would swarm away or cease producing honey. Whether every family truly practiced this custom is uncertain, but the belief lingered because bees were treated almost as members of the household. Single women were also hired for seasonal labour. During harvest, they bound sheaves, gathered fallen grain, and helped prepare meals for workers. Gleaning the collection of grain left behind after reaping was especially important to poorer women. A few handfuls collected each day could become flour for bread or seed for a small garden plot. Landowners sometimes restricted the practice, while villagers defended it as an old rite. Disputes over gleaning reveal how closely survival could depend on what remained scattered across a field. These women were visible, and visibility invited judgment. A married woman's place was assumed to be within her husband's household. An unmarried woman's position seemed less easily explained, particularly if she lived alone or earned money independently. Neighbours might ask why no man had chosen her, or why she had chosen none. Silence encouraged invention. Suspicion often gathered around age, poverty, and solitude. A woman who knew herbs or kept unusual hours could become the subject of anxious gossip. If milk soured, a child sickened, or livestock died unexpectedly, some villagers looked for human causes. The great witch trials had declined in many parts of Europe by the 18th century, but belief in harmful magic did not vanish overnight. Charms were still nailed above doors, horseshoes fixed near thresholds, and rowan twigs carried for protection in certain regions. An elderly unmarried woman could therefore be both healer and suspected threat. One neighbour might seek her remedy for a cough, while another whispered that she had caused it. She might prepare willow bark, thyme, honey, or warm ale seasoned with spices. She might advise tying a red thread around a child's wrist or placing iron near a cradle to discourage harmful spirits. Historians continue to debate how deeply such remedies were believed and how often they were simply habits repeated because older generations had used them. Not all suspicion concerned magic. A woman could be accused of laziness if she relied on parish relief, pride if she refused assistance, or immorality if unrelated men visited her cottage. Even generosity could be misread. Village morality was enforced less by law than by watching, remembering, and speaking. A quarrel at the well might follow someone for years. Yet village communities were rarely united in their judgment. The same woman mocked by one household might be defended by another. She might be poor but skilled, sharp-tongued but dependable, lonely yet deeply woven into parish life. Human relationships did not fit neatly into official labels. Some unmarried women rented rooms or small cottages. Their homes could be modest: a stool, a straw mattress, an iron pot, several wooden bowls, a chest for clothing, and perhaps a Bible or prayer book. Rushlights made from dried plant stems dipped in fat provided cheaper illumination than candles. Their flames were weak and uneven, but sufficient for mending or preparing food after dark. Food was plain: oatcakes, coarse bread, onions, cheese, pottage, and small ale formed much of the diet. On fortunate days there might be eggs, smoked fish, or a little bacon. A woman living alone had to guard fuel carefully. The fire might be allowed to sink low beneath ash overnight so that an ember survived until morning, saving the trouble of borrowing flame from a neighbour. Borrowing fire was itself part of village dependence. A coal carried in a shovel or covered pot could relight a cold hearth. Such exchanges created quiet obligations. One household lent yeast, another shared herbs, another offered a place beside the fire during illness. The unmarried woman who appeared isolated on paper might, in practice, belong to a dense network of favours and remembered kindnesses. As evening settled, smoke drifted above thatched roofs, and the last carts returned along muddy lanes. Somewhere a dog barked beside a gate. Somewhere a woman closed wooden shutters, placed an iron latch across her door, and folded herself beneath a patched wool blanket. Far across the fields, the church bell marked the hour, its sound softened by mist. She may have been called spinster, maid, aunt, servant, healer, or simply neighbour. The name depended on who was speaking. Beneath those names was a life shaped by labour and watchfulness, by small freedoms and constant vulnerability. She survived not outside the village but within its deepest rhythms, carrying water, memory, skill, and suspicion through the changing seasons. Work offered unmarried women neither complete freedom nor reliable security, yet it could provide the small measure of independence on which an entire life depended. A few coins earned at the spinning wheel, a place in a dairy, or payment for tending the sick might decide whether a woman remained beneath a relative's roof, rented a room of her own, or entered service in a household where every hour belonged to someone else. Much of this labour took place in dim interiors. Morning entered slowly through small windows, and winter work began before the sun had fully crossed the fields. A rushlight might burn in an iron holder, its thin flame fed by fat, while the hearth gave more smoke than warmth. The woman working beside it knew the value of every scrap of fuel. Peat, brushwood, and fallen branches were gathered carefully, for a cold room stiffened fingers and made fine work difficult. Spinning remained one of the most common ways to earn money at home. Wool first had to be cleaned, teased apart, and carded between toothed paddles until the fibres lay soft and even. Flax demanded still more preparation. It was soaked, dried, broken, and combed before it could become linen thread. The work filled the air with dust and left the hands rough. A skilled spinner learned to keep the thread even while turning the wheel with a steady rhythm. Payment was low because so many women could spin. Merchants delivered raw fibre and collected finished thread, judging its weight and quality with little generosity. A broken strand or uneven skein could reduce the amount paid. Some employer accused women of keeping back wool. Workers suspected merchants of using false weights. Those who recorded these disputes never fully agreed on how common fraud was, though distrust seems to have been familiar. Sewing offered another path. Unmarried women mended shirts, stitched caps, made shifts, altered gowns, and repaired household linen worn thin by repeated washing. Fine needlework required good light, so work moved close to the window during the day and close to the candle after sunset. Beeswax candles burned cleanly but were expensive. Tallow candles were more common, producing an odour that clung to walls and cloth. A seamstress might trim the wick with small snuffers, then bend once more over a cuff as shadows moved across the room. Some women became mantua makers, producing gowns for wealthier customers. Their skill brought better wages but also demanding clients and long hours. Cloth had to be measured carefully because mistakes were costly. Pins were stored in cushions and scraps were saved for patching. In some households, pins were counted when work began and again when it ended, partly because they were valuable and partly because a lost pin in bedding could produce an unpleasant surprise after dark. Brewing was heavier work. Women had brewed ale for their households for centuries, and some sold the surplus to neighbours or travellers. Grain was malted, crushed, mixed with hot water, strained, boiled, and cooled before yeast was added. Large vessels had to be lifted and scrubbed, fires managed, and temperatures judged without instruments. A brewer relied on experience, the feel of the mash, the smell of the steam, and the behaviour of the yeast. An unmarried alewife might earn a modest living if her brew was dependable. She could hang an ale stake outside her door to announce that drink was ready for sale. Local officers sometimes inspected measures and quality, and fines could follow if ale was considered weak or overpriced. No one can quite agree how consistently these rules were enforced. Friendship and reputation may have influenced judgment. Dairying also depended heavily on female labour. Before sunrise, cows were milked into pails. The milk was strained through cloth and left in shallow pans so cream could rise. Butter was churned, washed in cold water, and worked with wooden paddles. Cheese required rennet, careful heating, draining, pressing, and patient aging. A mistake in cleanliness or temperature could spoil days of labour. Dairymaids and unmarried farm women developed practical knowledge rarely written down. They knew which cow yielded richer milk, how weather altered cream, and when a cheese needed turning. Some people believed butter would not form if the churn had been bewitched. Iron might be placed nearby, a charm spoken, or hot water poured over the lid to defeat the suspected influence. Such practices existed besides sensible techniques, and it is often impossible to know where habit ended and belief began. Laundry work was harsher still. Linen was soaked, boiled with lye, beaten, rinsed, and spread over hedges or grass to bleach in the sun. Lye made from wood ash could burn the skin. Wet cloth became painfully heavy, especially in winter, when water-numbed hands and garments froze stiff on lines. There were also women who gathered herbs, prepared simples or nursed the sick, elderflower, mint, thyme, comfrey, and yarrow might be dried from rafters or stored in cloth bags. Honey soothed throats. Onion poultices were applied to swellings. Warm ale mixed with spices was offered against chills. Some remedies helped, some did little, and some were dangerous. Even now, historians continue to debate how knowledge moved between household practice and older folk tradition. Nursing required long hours beside beds in poorly ventilated rooms. A woman changed linen, emptied basins, prepared broth, cooled fevered skin, and watched breathing through the night. Payment might come in coins, food, old clothing, or promises written into a will. The work carried risk during outbreaks of smallpox or fever. Yet a dependable nurse could become known across several parishes, summoned by messengers along muddy roads. As evening deepened, the sounds of labour softened, the wheels slowed, the churn stood clean against the wall. Outside, wind moved through orchard branches, and rain tapped gently against the roof. Somewhere beyond the cottages, a bell marked the hour, its tones spreading over dark fields where frost had begun to gather. Inside, hands that had worked since dawn rested at last beside a fading fire. The income from such labour was usually small, but small sums mattered. They bought candles, bread, thread, rent, medicine, and occasionally privacy. They allowed some unmarried women to contribute to family households without appearing dependent. For others, they created the possibility of surviving alone. Independence did not arrive as a grand declaration. It accumulated slowly in skeins of yarn, pats of butter, repaired sleeves, jars of dried herbs, and coins hidden carefully inside a wooden chest. Work could exhaust the body and still preserve dignity, could expose women to exploitation while also giving them skill, reputation, and bargaining power. By candle and hearth, in dairies, washyards, kitchens, and sick rooms, Unmarried women built lives from tasks so ordinary that history often passed over them, though the world around them depended upon their quiet persistence. A room of one's own was rare enough in the 18th century, and for an unmarried woman it could be both refuge and reminder. Privacy depended less on preference than on money, architecture, and the patience of those with whom she lived. Many women slept in rooms shared with sisters, servants, nieces, or elderly relatives. Others occupied narrow chambers beneath sloping roofs, spaces too cold in winter and too hot in summer, reached by stairs that creaked beneath every step. In a prosperous manor house, an unmarried daughter might have a bedchamber furnished with a curtained bed, a washstand, a chest of drawers, and perhaps a small writing table near the window. Yet even such a room was not entirely private. Servants entered to light fires, empty chamber pots, beat rugs, and change linen. Mothers, companions, and visiting relatives came and went with little warning. Doors had locks, but keys were not always given to the woman who slept behind them. A poorer woman might rent a corner of a widow's cottage or share an attic with several workers. Her possessions could fit inside a single wooden chest 2 shifts, an apron, several caps, a wool petticoat, stockings, a prayer book, and perhaps a ribbon saved from younger days. The chest served as wardrobe, table, seat, and strong box. Its key might hang from a cord beneath her clothing, close to the body, for security depended on keeping small valuables hidden. Beds varied greatly. Wealthier households used feather mattresses laid over woven supports, while humbler beds were filled with straw, chaff, flock, or dried bracken. Straw had to be turned and replaced because dampness encouraged insects and unpleasant smells. Bed curtains offered warmth as well as modesty, creating a smaller chamber within the room. In winter, heated bricks, warming pans, or bottles of hot water might be placed beneath the covers, though careless use could scorch linen or cause fires. Some people placed sprigs of lavender, southernwood, or tansy among bedding to discourage fleas. Others trusted walnut leaves, strong vinegar, or powdered herbs. No one can quite agree how effective these remedies were, but their sharp scents must have seemed preferable to the creatures they were intended to repel. Cleanliness depended on labour, and washing large sheets required water, fuel, soap, space, and strong arms. Furniture was often mismatched and inherited. A woman might own a 3-legged stool, an oak chair polished smooth by generations, and a small table marked by knife cuts and candle wax. Wooden bowls and trenchers remained common, though pewter plates appeared in comfortable homes. A cracked cup might be repaired with metal staples rather than discarded. Objects were expected to last, passing through households long after the names of their first owners had been forgotten. Light was precious. A woman who earned her own wages understood exactly how much evening each candle purchased. Beeswax candles belonged mostly to churches and wealthy rooms, where they burned with a steady flame and mild scent. Tallow candles were cheaper but softened in warm weather, smoked when poorly trimmed, and attracted mice when left unattended. Rushlights cost less still. A single peeled rush dipped repeatedly in fat produced a narrow flame that might last less than an hour. By that light, an unmarried woman could create a brief private world. She might mend stockings, read a devotional book, calculate household expenses, or unfold an old letter. She might simply sit without speaking, listening to the building settle around her. Such moments were fragile. A call from below, a crying child, or a knock from a landlord could end them immediately. Meals also revealed degrees of independence. A woman living with relatives usually ate what the household ate: bread, cheese, pottage, onions, salted meat, and small ale. Meals were taken according to rank and work. In great houses, servants ate together below stairs, while gentlewomen dined in more formal rooms. A dependent unmarried aunt could occupy an awkward place between family and servant, invited to the table yet expected to make herself useful before and after the meal. Women lodging alone prepared simpler food. Oatmeal could be boiled with water or milk, bread might be softened in broth, a small piece of bacon flavoured several days of pottage, apples, dried peas, cabbage, and herrings added variety when available. Tea became increasingly common during the century, though it remained expensive and was sometimes stretched by reusing leaves or mixing them with cheaper plants. The tea caddy in a wealthy home might be kept locked, with the key held by the mistress. Tea was valuable enough to tempt servants and visitors, and control over it became a sign of household authority. An unmarried woman who was trusted with the key possessed a small but visible dignity. She measured the leaves, warmed the pot, and poured beneath the eyes of the family. Clothing required similar care. A woman's outer gown might be altered many times as fashions changed or cloth wore thin. Sleeves were replaced, hems turned, and faded sections hidden beneath aprons or shawls. Underneath, linen shifts absorbed sweat and protected expensive garments from the body. These shifts were washed more frequently than gowns, though frequently depended greatly on access to clean water and spare clothing. Caps covered the hair for practical and social reasons. They kept dust and grease away, signalled modesty, and could indicate age or status. An unmarried woman's cap might be plainer than that of a married neighbour, though customs differed from one region to another. Some wore ribbons or finer lace on feast days. A fur-lined cloak, if she possessed one, offered valuable warmth on winter journeys to church or market. Pockets were separate cloth bags tied around the waist beneath the gown, and reached through openings in the skirt. They could hold keys, coins, sewing tools, a handkerchief, dried herbs, or a small knife. Because they were hidden, pockets offered women a rare form of personal storage. Pickpockets knew this, of course, though the layers of clothing made theft less straightforward than it might appear. Privacy was not only physical. Letters, memories, grief, and hope also required places of concealment. A woman might hide a note beneath linen, inside a Bible, or behind the lining of a chest. Some kept recipe books containing household remedies beside personal reflections, financial records, or names meaningful only to the writer. Even now, historians continue to debate how much private thought can be recovered from such scattered pages. Outside, evening folded over the roofs. Rain whispered against shutters, and smoke drifted low above the lane. A watchman's footsteps passed somewhere beyond the wall, followed by the faint call of the hour. Within her chamber, a woman trimmed the candle, checked the latch, and placed her shoes beside the bed so they could be found in darkness. Her room might belong to someone else, its furniture might be borrowed, its fire rationed, and its walls thin enough to carry every conversation. Yet for a little while, after the household quieted, it became hers, in that narrow space, surrounded by worn wood, folded cloth, and fading light. She possessed something close to solitude. In the great houses of the 18th century, unmarried women moved through a world governed by bells, keys, stairs, and rank. A manor might appear peaceful from the road, its stone walls softened by ivy, its windows glowing warmly after sunset. Yet behind that calm exterior, dozens of servants rose before dawn, carried coal through narrow passages, polished silver, scrubbed floors, emptied ashes, and prepared rooms that were meant to seem as though no labour had touched them. For many unmarried women, domestic service offered food, lodging, wages, and a recognised place in the household. It also demanded obedience. A young woman might enter service at 12, 14, or 16, leaving her village with a bundle of clothing and perhaps a letter of character from a clergyman or former employer. Her first post might be as a scullery maid, kitchen maid, nursery servant, or general maid in a smaller household where one person performed the work of several. The day began in darkness. Before the family woke, kitchen fires had to be revived from embers or struck anew with flint and steel. Ashes were carried out, grates cleaned, water hauled, and pots scoured with sand. In winter, passages remained bitterly cold, and servants breathed mist into the air as they crossed stone floors. Their shoes grew damp near back doors where mud from the yard had been tracked inside. Rushes had largely disappeared from the floors of fashionable houses by this period, replaced by boards, tiles, carpets, and rugs. But older service rooms sometimes retained rough coverings that trapped dust and spilled grease. The work of cleaning never truly ended. Soot settled on walls, candle wax hardened on furniture, and smoke from kitchen chimneys darkened rafters despite constant effort. A housemaid learned to move quietly. She carried hot water to bedchambers, drew curtains, shook feather beds, emptied chamber pots, and swept hearths. She brushed clothing and collected shoes for polishing. The family expected these tasks to be completed without disturbance. A servant who knocked too loudly, dropped a coal scuttle, or allowed a fire to die might be sharply corrected. The hierarchy among servants was as carefully observed as that of the family above stairs. The housekeeper, usually an older and often unmarried woman, supervised female servants, controlled stores, and guarded keys to linen, tea, sugar, candles, and preserved foods. Her room could be one of the most comfortable in the servants' quarters, furnished with a desk, cupboards, and perhaps a small fire. She possessed authority, yet her security still depended on the favour of the household. Below her stood ladies' maids, cooks, upper housemaids, laundry maids, nursery maids, kitchen maids, and scullery maids. Exact ranks differed between houses, and no one can quite agree how consistently these distinctions were observed outside the grandest establishments. In practice, illness, travel, and sudden guests often forced servants to perform whatever work was needed. A lady's maid occupied an unusual position. She dressed her mistress, arranged hair, cared for delicate gowns, packed trunks, and sometimes carried private messages. She knew intimate details that other servants did not: family quarrels, hidden debts, illnesses, disappointments, and letters received after dark. Discretion was therefore essential. A maid who repeated what she heard might lose not only her position but her reputation, making future employment difficult. Clothing required extraordinary attention. Silk gowns were brushed rather than frequently washed. Lace was removed, cleaned separately, and sewn back into place. Stains were treated with chalk, spirits, soap, or other mixtures whose effectiveness varied. Some manuals recommended breadcrumbs for cleaning wallpaper and delicate surfaces, while greasy marks might be attacked with fuller's earth. Historians continue to debate how widely such printed advice reached ordinary servants, many of whom relied instead on methods taught by older women. The kitchen formed another kingdom within the house. Heat, steam, knives, and strict timing ruled the space. A female cook in a wealthy household could hold considerable authority. She planned dishes, managed assistants, judged meat, ordered supplies through the steward, and guarded recipes that enhanced her reputation. Her work was skilled, but physically punishing. Fires burned for hours, roasting spits turned, sauces thickened, and pastries demanded steady hands even when the room became nearly unbearable. Kitchen maids plucked poultry, cleaned fish, peeled roots, chopped herbs, and carried heavy pans. Scullery maids scrubbed greasy vessels in water that quickly turned black. Ash, sand, and lye roughened their skin. Cuts and burns were common, though remedies were simple: butter, Flour paste, honey, or plant salves might be applied to burns, while cobwebs were sometimes pressed against small wounds to stop bleeding. Whether the web itself helped mattered less than the pressure. Though such distinctions were not understood at the time, meals reinforced rank. The family ate in polished rooms by candlelight, using china, silver, and linen napkins. Servants ate below stairs at fixed times when work allowed. The upper servants might dine apart from the lower staff. A young maid could learn quickly that sitting in the wrong place or speaking too freely in front of a superior servant was a serious breach of order. Food below stairs was often plain but more dependable than what many labouring families enjoyed. Servants might receive bread, cheese, broth, cold meat, beer, and leftovers from the family table. Yet scraps were not simply taken without permission. Dripping, candle ends, bones, worn linen, and kitchen waste all had value and could become sources of theft accusations. Rules touched nearly every aspect of life. Servants might be forbidden to receive visitors, leave the house without permission, or remain out after a set hour. Courtship was watched closely because marriage often meant resignation. Employers feared distraction, pregnancy, scandal, and the loss of trained staff. An unmarried maid who formed an attachment to a footman, groom, tradesman, or local labourer risked gossip from both servants and family. Yet courtship found its spaces. A few words might be exchanged near the servants' entrance, in the stable yard, or during an errand to market. Letters passed through sympathetic hands. Small gifts were hidden in apron pockets. Some houses permitted annual fairs or servants' dances, though even there older staff watched younger people with attentive eyes. Belief and superstition also travelled through service corridors. A maid might refuse to sweep dust over an unmarried woman's feet, for fear she would never wed. Salt spilled at table could be thrown over the left shoulder. A knife and fork crossed accidentally might foretell a quarrel, while a candle burning blue was sometimes taken as a sign of a spirit nearby. These beliefs were carried from villages into manor houses and shared in whispers after the family had gone to bed. Night did not always bring rest. Servants waited while guests remained over wine, cards, or conversation. Fires had to be tended, candles replaced, doors opened, and carriages called. Footsteps echoed through halls long after midnight. A maid sleeping beneath the roof might be summoned by a bell connected through wires to a distant bedchamber. At last, the house quieted. Flames shrank behind grates, and moonlight rested across the courtyard. In the servants' rooms, women loosened caps, rubbed aching hands, and lay down in shared beds beneath coarse blankets. Somewhere below, a clock marked another hour, followed by the faint settling of old timbers. Service could provide friendship, skill, and a path toward better positions. It could also leave a woman dismissed without notice, injured, exhausted, or too old for demanding work. Still, within those candlelit halls, unmarried servants built complex lives of loyalty, rivalry, endurance, and private hope, making possible the comfort that others mistook for effortless order. Beyond the kitchens and service corridors of great houses, unmarried women could also be found behind shop counters, beneath market awnings, beside inn doors, and among the crowded stalls of weekly fairs. Here, their work was public. It required skill, endurance, careful memory, and the ability to withstand neighbours who believed they knew what kind of woman ought to stand alone in trade. A market morning began before daylight. Carts arrived along muddy roads carrying eggs, cheese, onions, cloth, and live poultry in wicker cages. Stallholders lifted shutters and arranged goods on rough tables. In winter, breath hung white in the air. In summer, dust rose beneath boots and hooves. Bells from the church or market house marked the opening hour, while toll collectors moved among traders demanding payment for the right to sell. An unmarried woman might bring butter, candles, stockings, herbs, or small quantities of ale. She might have produced the goods herself or purchased them from others for resale. Every coin mattered. Customers sometimes tried to pay with worn or clipped money, so traders learned to judge coins by weight, edge, and sound. Weights and measures created disagreement. Bread was sold by regulated sizes, ale by approved measures, cloth by the yard, and grain by local standards that differed from town to town. Officials inspected scales, but no one can quite agree how honest those inspections were. A merchant with friends in the corporation might receive gentler treatment than a poor woman with no one to speak for her. Market tolls could be burdensome. A seller might pay for entering the town, occupying a stall, weighing goods, or bringing animals through a gate. Some women claimed old rights to trade without certain fees, especially if they inherited a family business. Others faced fines for setting up in unauthorized places. Shopkeeping offered greater stability, though it demanded capital. A small shop might occupy the front room of a house, with living quarters behind or above it. Shelves held candles, needles, thread, paper, soap, spices, ribbons, tobacco, and jars of sweets. Goods were often locked away because pilfering was common. A shopkeeper kept tallies, receipts, and account books. Many customers bought on credit, promising payment after harvest or payday. An unmarried woman who could read and reckon had an advantage. She needed to add pounds, shillings, and pence, track deliveries, and remember which customers were dependable. Formal arithmetic was not always taught to girls, but practical mathematics could be learned at the counter. A small mistake repeated often might erase a week's profit. Credit created relationships as much as money did. Refusing a neighbour could cause offence. Extending too much could ruin the shop. A skilled trader learned to say no without making an enemy. She might offer a smaller quantity, accept eggs in partial payment, or wait until market day. Such arrangements rarely appeared in official records, yet they kept local economies moving. Some women inherited businesses from fathers, brothers, or employers. Others built them gradually from domestic labour. A seamstress might begin by repairing clothes, then sell ribbons and pins. A baker might add a front counter. A brewer might open a room for customers and become an innkeeper. The boundary between household and business was thin. The same hearth-heated pottage, warmed ale, and baked goods for sale. Inns offered opportunity but little quiet. An unmarried innkeeper managed drink, food, beds, stables, servants, and travellers whose manners varied with the weather and the strength of the ale. She measured drink, settled disputes, guarded keys, and decided who could sleep beneath her roof. Magistrates licensed alehouses, and a woman whose establishment gained a poor reputation could lose the right to trade. Licensing records sometimes reveal women accused of serving after permitted hours, encouraging gaming, or allowing disorder. Some accusations were justified, others may have reflected hostility toward women who held visible authority. Historians continue to debate how often moral complaints disguised economic rivalry. The alehouse had its own customs. A tally might be carved or chalked to record drinks bought on credit. Tankards were measured, watered ale was condemned, and pewter vessels could be stamped to show approval. A traveller arriving after dark might place a coin on the table before requesting food, signalling that payment was possible. Those without money offered news, labour, or small objects, though an experienced keeper knew that a fine story did not always settle a bill. Women also worked within trades governed by guilds. In some towns, widows could continue a husband's workshop, but unmarried women faced greater obstacles. They might work as seamstresses, milliners, lace workers, chandlers, or sellers of second-hand clothing. Female apprenticeships were often less formally recorded than male ones. Even now, historians continue to uncover women's names hidden in tax lists, advertisements, and legal petitions. A milliner handled ribbons, lace, caps, gloves, and decorative goods. Her shop attracted female customers and offered respectability, though fashion invited moral suspicion. Bright ribbons and changing styles were sometimes condemned from pulpits as vanity. This rarely prevented customers from examining the newest trim after Sunday worship. Second-hand clothing formed a lively trade because garments were too valuable to discard. Coats, gowns, waistcoats, stockings, and shoes passed through many owners. A dealer inspected seams, stains, missing buttons, and hidden damage. Clothing from the dead could be sold, inherited, or given to servants. Some people feared garments carried illness or misfortune, while others cared only whether the cloth was sound. The market also exposed women to harassment and theft. Crowds pressed close. Drunken customers argued over prices. Pickpockets worked among baskets and cloaks. A woman trading alone needed a strong voice and allies nearby. Neighbouring sellers watched one another's stalls during brief absences. As afternoon faded, unsold goods were wrapped and packed. Wilted herbs were tied for household use. Broken candles were saved for remelting. Coins disappeared into hidden pockets beneath skirts. The square slowly emptied, leaving straw, cabbage leaves, feathers, and wheel marks in the mud. Evening mist gathered near the roofs. Shutters closed one by one, and lanterns appeared behind the horn or glass panes. From an inn came the low murmur of travellers settling near the fire. Farther away, a bell sounded over the town walls, calling people home before the gates were secured. For an unmarried woman, trade offered visibility, risk, and a kind of authority. She could own stock, extend credit, hire help, and make decisions in her own name. Yet one illness, one unpaid debt, or one malicious rumour could undo years of effort. Her independence rested on ledgers, keys, regular customers, and the strength to open the shutters again each morning. Between the security of a family home and the independence of paid trade lay another quieter world, occupied by governesses, companions, tutors, and dependent gentlewomen. These unmarried women often lived beneath respectable roofs and ate at respectable tables, yet their place within the household remained uncertain. They were neither servants in the ordinary sense nor members of the family, and much of their daily life was shaped by that uncomfortable space between belonging and employment. A governess was usually expected to possess education, good manners, and a reputation beyond reproach. She taught daughters to read, write, sew, draw, play music, speak French, and behave with the composure expected of young women in polite society. In wealthier homes, masters might be hired for dancing or music, but the governess remained responsible for the steady routine of lessons, correction, and supervision. Her day began early. Before the children arrived, she might prepare copybooks, sharpen quills, arrange embroidery frames, or review passages from scripture and history. Ink had to be mixed carefully, often from powder or concentrated liquid, and quills were cut with a small penknife. A badly shaped nib scratched the paper or scattered drops across the page, and paper was too valuable to waste casually. Lessons took place in a schoolroom, nursery, or spare chamber away from the grander rooms of the house. The fire there was often smaller, and in winter the governess might teach while wearing fingerless gloves beneath her cuffs. The children sat on wooden chairs, recited multiplication tables, copied moral sayings, and practiced handwriting until the letters stood evenly between ruled lines. Education for girls was broad enough to make them agreeable, but not always broad enough to make them independent. A governess taught accomplishment as much as knowledge. Her pupils learned how to enter a room, pour tea, address elders, and avoid appearing either ignorant or overly learned. Some families believed too much study harmed a young woman's health or made her unsuitable for marriage. No one can quite agree how widely such anxieties were accepted, though they appear often enough in letters and advice books to have shaped many schoolrooms. Discipline had to be firm but restrained. A governess who was too gentle risked losing control of her pupils. One who was too severe could be dismissed. Children understood the weakness of her position. A spoiled daughter might refuse a lesson, knowing her mother would defend her. A son might mock the governess's clothing or imitate her accent, confident that she possessed little authority beyond the schoolroom door. At meals, the governess's place revealed her status. In some households, she dined with the family, expected to join conversation without dominating it. In others, she ate alone with the children or received a tray in her room. She might be invited into the drawing room when guests were absent, then disappear when company arrived. Familiar enough to be useful and distant enough to be overlooked, she lived among people who knew her habits, but sometimes knew very little about her. Her wages were often modest, especially compared with the cost of maintaining respectable clothing. A governess could not dress like a maid, yet she could not afford the changing fashions of her employers. Gowns were altered repeatedly, cuffs concealed frayed sleeves, ribbons were turned so the faded side lay beneath. A dark wool dress could survive years if brushed, patched, and protected from moths with lavender, camphor, or cedar shavings. Employment was rarely permanent. When pupils grew older, married, or were sent elsewhere for education, the governess's position ended. She then depended on references. A favourable letter from a former employer might secure another post. An ambiguous sentence could close every door. Because reputation mattered so greatly, even harmless gossip became dangerous. The paid companion occupied a similarly uncertain place. She was usually hired by an older woman, widow, invalid, or socially isolated gentlewoman who required conversation, assistance, and company. Her duties were difficult to define. She read aloud, answered letters, accompanied walks, arranged medicine, carried shawls, poured tea, and listened through long afternoons. She might travel with her employer to country houses, spa towns, or seaside lodgings. Yet travel did not bring freedom. She supervised trunks, checked tickets, dealt with innkeepers, and ensured that hot bricks or warmed pans were placed in beds before her employer retired. At coaching inns, she might sleep in a small adjoining chamber, alert for a bell in the night. Reading aloud demanded stamina. Novels, sermons, newspapers, travel accounts, and devotional works could occupy several hours each day. The companion adjusted her voice according to the material, pausing when her employer wished to comment or complain. A cough, mispronounced name, or moment of inattention could be judged as carelessness. Some companions were relatives receiving board and clothing rather than wages. A poor cousin might live with a wealthy widow in exchange for useful presents. Such arrangements could appear generous while leaving the dependent woman with no savings and little control. She could be dismissed after a quarrel or displaced when another relative arrived. Among genteel families, there were also unmarried daughters who became permanent household companions to parents. They managed correspondence, supervised servants, nursed illness, and received visitors. Their labour was described as devotion rather than employment, which meant it often earned no income. When the parent died, the daughter might discover that the house belonged to a brother, and that years of service had secured neither property nor a lasting home. Some women accepted these lives willingly. They valued books, quiet rooms, and the relative comfort of a respectable household. A governess might form deep bonds with her pupils. A companion might share genuine affection with the woman who employed her. Surviving letters sometimes reveal warmth, gratitude, and friendships that lasted long after formal service ended. Other records speak of loneliness. The governess heard laughter from rooms where she was not invited. The companion spent evenings listening to memories that were not her own. A dependent aunt watched younger relatives marry and leave while she remained beside the same window, arranging flowers or mending gloves. Small rituals softened the isolation. A woman kept a notebook of quotations, pressed flowers between pages, or saved letters tied with silk thread. She might maintain a tiny tea service in her chamber and brew a cup after the household retired. Tea leaves were sometimes read for signs of the future, though whether this was earnest belief or private amusement remains uncertain. The shapes left in the cup could be interpreted as journeys, visitors, rings, birds, or warnings. There were moments of peace as well. In the late afternoon, a governess might walk with her pupils along a gravel path while winter light faded over bare hedges. A companion might sit near a tall window, reading as rain touched the glass. From the servants' courtyard came the soft clatter of pails, then the closing of a door. Somewhere beyond the house, bells sounded across misted fields. At night, these women returned to modest rooms furnished with a narrow bed, a wash basin, a chair, and perhaps a small desk. They folded their respectable gowns, covered the fire, and placed letters beneath a ribbon or inside a drawer. The household around them settled into silence, but their position remained unresolved. They were educated yet dependent, trusted yet excluded, intimate with families that might never consider them equal. Their hidden lives unfolded through lessons, walks, medicine bottles, copied letters, and endless cups of tea. In the quiet world of companions, unmarried women exchanged certainty for shelter and independence for respectability, building careful lives in rooms that were always almost, but never entirely, their own. For unmarried women whose lives could not be supported by family, trade, or private employment, the walls of religious and charitable institutions offered another uncertain refuge. By the 18th century, the great medieval convents of many Protestant regions had long since been dissolved, their cloisters broken apart, their lands sold, and their bells silenced. Yet the habits of communal female life had not vanished entirely. They survived in hospitals, almshouses, charitable schools, religious communities, and small foundations where women lived under rules that still carried faint echoes of the monastic world. In Catholic parts of Europe, convents continued to receive women who chose or were persuaded to enter religious life. Some came with genuine devotion. Others arrived because family fortunes could not provide suitable marriages, because a scandal required quiet concealment, or because illness and disability made ordinary household life difficult. A convent demanded a dowry in many cases, though the sum was often lower than what a respectable marriage required. Even so, poorer women might enter only as lay sisters, performing heavy domestic work rather than joining the choir nuns who devoted more time to prayer and reading. Daily life followed the bell. Before dawn, the first summons called women from narrow beds in plain cells or shared dormitories. Prayers mark the hours, just as monastery bells had once measured time across medieval valleys. Between services came work baking bread, tending gardens, washing linen, preparing medicines, teaching girls, copying letters, and caring for the sick. The rhythm was orderly, though not always peaceful. Communities contained friendships, rivalries, disputes over rank, and the ordinary irritations of people living closely together. A nun from a wealthy family might bring fine linen, devotional books, silver objects, or income from family property. A poorer sister might own little beyond a coarse habit: wooden rosary, blanket, and drinking cup. Official rules encouraged simplicity, but practice varied. Some convents became comfortable institutions with warm kitchens, enclosed gardens, music, and well-stocked storerooms. Others struggled with leaking roofs, poor food, and chronic debt. Meals were taken in silence in stricter houses. A reader stood at a lectern and recited scripture, saints' lives, or moral instruction while the community ate bread, vegetables, cheese, fish, and thin broth. Meat might be restricted according to rule or season. On feast days, richer dishes appeared: eggs, sweetened pastries, spiced wine, or preserved fruit. The contrast between ordinary fare and festival food gave the year its shape. Older beliefs clung to these spaces. Relics were kept in small cases, sometimes fragments of bone, cloth, or wood believed to be connected to saints. Pilgrims might visit convent chapels to pray before them, leaving coins, candles, ribbons, or written requests. No one can quite agree how many relics were authentic, and even contemporary observers sometimes expressed doubt. But their emotional power was real. A woman grieving a lost child or failed marriage might kneel before a saint's image and find comfort that no legal document could provide. In Protestant countries, where convents had disappeared, female religious life took different forms. Pious unmarried women sometimes lived together informally, supported by donations or family property. They taught poor children, visited prisoners, prepared clothing for the needy, or distributed food during winter. Their communities lacked the ancient legal structure of convents, yet their days could still resemble older devotional households. Charitable hospitals also depended on women. These institutions were not hospitals in the modern sense. Some housed the elderly, the disabled, foundlings, or the chronically poor. Others cared for the sick in large shared wards where beds stood close together beneath high windows. Air carried the smells of vinegar, smoke, boiled linen, sweat, and medicinal herbs. Floors were scrubbed with sand, and straw mattresses were replaced when they became too soiled or infested. Unmarried nurses and attendants performed much of the work. They carried basins, changed bedding, prepared gruel, washed bodies, emptied chamber pots, and sat through long nights beside fevered patients. Their duties required patience more than formal medical training. Physicians might visit briefly, prescribe bleeding, purging, or medicines, and then depart. The nurse remained behind to observe whether the patient slept, sweated, coughed, or worsened. Treatments combined practical care with inherited theory. Vinegar was used to clean rooms and protect against foul air. Bundles of rosemary, juniper, or rue might be burned during outbreaks of disease. Pomanders filled with aromatic substances were carried close to the nose, based on the belief that pleasant scents could guard against corruption in the air. Historians continue to debate how consistently such practices were followed outside wealthier institutions. But the fear of bad air shaped hospital life for generations. Women in hospitals also prepared the dead. Bodies were washed, wrapped in linen, and carried to burial with prayers or brief ceremony. This work placed attendants near the boundary between life and death, a boundary that 18th-century people encountered more often and more openly than many do today. Some nurses became known for calmness in such moments. Others relied on whispered prayers, protective charms, or small devotional objects hidden beneath their clothing. Almshouses offered another form of shelter, founded by wealthy patrons, guilds, parishes, or religious benefactors. They provided rooms for selected poor people, often elderly widows and unmarried women of respectable character. Admission could depend on birthplace, church attendance, occupation, or recommendation. Residents received modest allowances of bread, coal, cloth, or money. In return, They followed rules. An almshouse woman might be required to attend prayers, wear a prescribed gown, keep her room clean, and avoid drunkenness, quarrelling, or overnight visitors. Some foundations issued distinctive clothing and dark colours, making residents recognisable in the town. The uniform offered dignity and stigma at once. Rooms were small but precious. A resident might have a bed, table, stool, fireplace, cupboard, and patch of garden. She grew onions, leeks, sage, and perhaps marigolds for salves. Coal allowances rarely lasted through severe winters, so women gathered fallen wood or sat together in one heated room. They shared broth, gossip, and memories of households long gone. Charitable schools also employed unmarried women as teachers and matrons. Girls were taught reading, sewing, knitting, spinning, and household discipline. The goal was often to prepare them for domestic service rather than intellectual independence. Teachers supervised meals, prayers, washing, and sleep as carefully as lessons. A child's stitches were inspected, her posture corrected, and her conduct recorded. Discipline could be severe, but some institutions offered protection from hunger, violence, or the streets. Records are uneven, and those who recorded these stories rarely agreed on whether charity was merciful or controlling. It was usually both. Assistance came with surveillance, food came with rules, shelter required gratitude and obedience. At dusk, the building settled into a silence different from that of private houses. Footsteps faded along stone corridors. Lamps were extinguished one by one. In a chapel, the last candle burned before a carved figure or simple cross. Beyond the walls, mist gathered over fields and roofs, while a bell marked the closing hour with slow, measured strokes. Within those walls, unmarried women found forms of community unavailable elsewhere. They prayed, worked, nursed, taught, grieved, and aged together. Some felt confined, some felt rescued, some discovered authority as matrons, teachers, or senior sisters. Their lives preserved the memory of older female religious worlds, not unchanged, but carried forward in habits of service, shared meals, locked gates, herb gardens, and bells sounding through the darkness. Beyond the almshouse gate and the hospital ward, knowledge of illness travelled along quieter paths. It passed from mother to daughter, from neighbour to neighbour, from old servant to young maid, and sometimes into the hands of an unmarried woman whose reputation grew until people came to her door from several villages away. She might be called a healer, nurse, herbal woman, midwife, bone setter, or wise woman, though the names used for her often revealed as much about the speaker as they did about her work. Such women rarely possessed formal medical training. Their knowledge was gathered slowly through experience, observation, memory, and repetition. They learned which plants eased a cough, which poultices softened swelling, how to clean a wound, how to sit patiently beside fever, and when a sick person required more help than they could give. Some inherited notebooks filled with recipes written in several hands. Others carried everything in memory. An unmarried healer might live in a cottage at the edge of a village, close enough to be summoned but distant enough to attract speculation. Bundles of herbs hung from soot-dark rafters. Thyme, sage, mint, lavender, tansy, yarrow, and feverfew. Dried roots were stored in cloth bags or earthen jars. Honey stood in stoppered pots, while vinegar, spirits, oils, and rendered fats formed the bases of washes and salves. Her work followed the seasons. Spring brought tender leaves and young shoots. Flowers were gathered during summer when their scent was strongest. Roots were dug in autumn, once the upper growth had faded. Bark could be collected at particular times, and seeds were dried on trays near the hearth. Some believed plants were most powerful when cut before sunrise, beneath a certain moon, or on the feast day of a saint associated with healing. No one can quite agree whether such timings were widely followed or preserved only in particular districts. Practical knowledge and superstition lived side by side. A healer might understand that clean linen helped a wound while also tying a charm around the patient's arm. She might prepare willow bark for pain, though she could not know the chemistry that made it useful. Honey was applied to sores, warm steam used to ease breathing, and comfrey laid over bruises or broken bones. Other remedies were less helpful. Tobacco smoke, mercury compounds, harsh purges, and dangerous quantities of opium could injure those they were meant to cure. The boundaries between household medicine and formal treatment were uncertain. Physicians served wealthier patients and based much of their practice on learned theory. Apothecaries prepared drugs and sold medicines. Surgeons set bones, removed growths, opened abscesses, and performed other procedures that required steady hands. Yet in many villages, these men lived far away or charged more than poor families could pay. The local healer was nearer, cheaper, and already knew the household. Payment came in many forms. A woman might receive eggs, candles, grain, firewood, old clothing, or a few coins placed discreetly on the table. Poor neighbours promised help at harvest or mending in return. Sometimes there was no payment at all. The healer's authority depended not on a certificate but on memory who recovered after her visit, whose pain eased, whose child survived the winter. Failure was remembered too. If a patient died, grief could turn toward blame. Illness was poorly understood, and the same community that praised a woman's skill might accuse her of causing harm. An unmarried healer was especially vulnerable because she lacked a husband whose standing could shield her from rumour. Independence, knowledge, and solitude could appear threatening when misfortune entered a household. Old fears of witchcraft had not disappeared entirely. Formal prosecutions declined through much of the 18th century, but belief in curses, the evil eye, and harmful charms continued in many places. A cow that ceased giving milk, butter that would not form, or a child who suffered unexplained fits might be blamed on malice. A healer who knew how to undo a supposed curse could be respected as a protector. Yet people sometimes wondered whether the same knowledge could also be used to create one. Iron objects were placed beneath beds or near cradles. Red thread was tied around wrists. Small bags containing herbs, hair, written words, or pieces of bone might be worn beneath clothing. Some charms included passages from scripture folded into tiny squares. Others used symbols older than the people who carried them. Clergymen condemned many of these practices, though even devout families could keep a protective object hidden near the door. Midwifery brought women closest to both trust and danger. Most births took place at home, attended by female relatives, neighbours, servants, and a midwife. Men were often excluded unless complications became severe. The room was warmed, curtains drawn, water heated, and linen prepared. Chairs, stools, or the edge of a bed supported the labouring woman, while attendants offered broth, ale, encouragement, and prayer. A midwife needed calmness, physical strength, and knowledge gained through repeated attendance. She judged the progress of labour, recognised certain dangerous positions, cut the cord, washed the child, and watched for bleeding. Some were licensed by church or local authority, though requirements varied. An oath might demand that the midwife avoid secret baptisms, harmful practices, or the concealment of an infant's parentage. Emergency baptism carried special importance. If a newborn seemed unlikely to live, the midwife might baptize the child immediately so that its soul would not remain outside the church. The words and water had to be used correctly. Such responsibility gave her spiritual authority at a moment when life appeared painfully uncertain. Objects associated with childbirth were surrounded by belief. Knots might be loosened in clothing to encourage the body to open. Cupboards and doors were sometimes left unlatched for the same reason. Relics, saints' medals, or printed prayers could be placed near the bed. In Protestant regions, official teaching discouraged many older customs, but anxiety preserved them in private. An unmarried midwife could devote herself fully to the work, travelling whenever summoned. She crossed lanes at night carrying a lantern, linens, scissors, thread, oils, and perhaps a small bottle of spirits. Winter journeys were especially difficult. Frozen ground made footsteps uncertain, while rain transformed roads into deep mud. A boy or husband from the labouring household might guide her with a torch. The work did not end when the child arrived. She examined the mother, prepared warm drinks, showed relatives how to wrap the infant, and returned during the following days if needed. Remedies for milk flow, fever, bleeding, and pain were passed down through generations. Some soothed, others did little. Historians continue to debate how closely surviving recipe books reflect what ordinary midwives truly used. There were also bone setters, some of them women, who treated fractures and dislocations through touch and practiced judgment. A skilled bone setter could detect what others missed. Splints were made from wood or stiff material and secured with cloth. Swelling was treated with cold water, vinegar, herbs, or rest. Success brought patients from distant parishes. Failure could leave lasting deformity. As evening darkened the lanes, a healer might return home after hours beside a sickbed. Her cloak smelled of rain, smoke, and crushed herbs. She set down her basket, stirred the embers, and washed her hands in a basin of cold water. Outside, the village slept beneath thatch and tile. A dog moved in the yard, and a church bell sounded faintly through the mist. Her knowledge gave her a place in the community, but never complete safety. She stood where gratitude met suspicion, where practical care met inherited belief, and where life and death were separated by little more than breath, warmth, and time. In that uneasy space, unmarried healers carried remedies, secrets, and responsibilities from one candlelit room to another. In a world where most labour was performed by hand and most thoughts were carried by memory, the written word possessed a special kind of quiet power. For unmarried women in the 18th century, books, letters, diaries, and small collections of notes could create private spaces that existed beyond the rooms where they worked and the roles others assigned to them. Literacy was far from universal, and access to education depended greatly on wealth, location, religion, and family choice. A daughter of a prosperous household might learn reading, writing, music, and languages from a tutor or governess. A village girl might only learn enough letters to recognize prayers, sign her name, or read simple instructions. Yet even limited literacy could transform daily life. A woman who could read a letter, keep accounts, or write a message possessed a skill that carried practical value. The act of writing itself required patience. Paper was expensive, especially compared with today's abundance. A sheet might be saved for important correspondence, while rough drafts were written on scraps or reused pages. Ink was stored carefully in small bottles, and quills needed regular trimming with a sharp knife. Writing by candlelight was tiring, and a cramped hand could reveal the discomfort of the writer's position. An unmarried woman's letters often travelled between emotional worlds. She wrote to sisters who had married and moved away, to relatives in distant towns, to former employers, or to friends whose lives had followed different paths. A letter carried news of births, illnesses, harvests, household disputes, and deaths. It also carried small observations: the price of bread, the arrival of spring flowers, the behaviour of neighbours, or the condition of a beloved garden. Many letters were practical rather than romantic. A woman might request money, ask for clothing, describe a servant's illness, or explain why she could not visit. Yet beneath these ordinary details, historians sometimes find glimpses of personality. A carefully chosen phrase, a repeated concern, or a humorous remark reveals a person who existed beyond official records. No one can quite agree how many women kept private writings, because survival depends on chance. Paper decays, families discard old letters, diaries may be hidden, destroyed, or never intended to survive. The women who left no written record were not necessarily silent. They simply left behind fewer traces. Diaries offered another form of companionship. Some women recorded weather, expenses, prayers, visitors, household tasks, and personal reflections. A diary might begin with simple notes about rain or purchases, and slowly become a place where worries and hopes were expressed. The writer could admit thoughts she would never speak aloud beside a crowded hearth. Religious devotion often filled these pages. Women copied prayers, recorded sermons, listed moral reflections, or described moments of spiritual uncertainty. In Protestant communities especially, personal examination of conscience became important. A woman might write about whether she'd been patient, grateful, charitable, or too attached to worldly concerns. Catholic women likewise kept devotional materials, prayer books, and collections of saints' sayings. Some recorded feast days, family anniversaries, and prayers for the dead. Small holy objects could be stored between pages: a pressed flower from a pilgrimage, a piece of ribbon, or a written blessing. The boundary between memory and devotion was often thin. Books themselves were valuable possessions. A small personal library suggested education and status. Religious works were common, but women also read poetry, novels, histories, household manuals, medical guides, and travel accounts. The growth of printed literature in the 18th century brought more books into homes, though access remained unequal. A woman reading alone could appear both admirable and suspicious. Many praised female reading as a sign of refinement, yet some worried that novels encouraged unrealistic expectations or distracted women from domestic duties. A young, unmarried woman absorbed in books might be admired for intelligence or criticized for neglecting practical concerns. The same action could be interpreted differently depending on who was watching. Reading circles and borrowed books created communities beyond households. Friends exchanged novels, discussed sermons, and shared opinions about public events. A woman who could not afford many books might borrow from relatives, subscribe through a circulating library, or read aloud with others. These libraries became especially important in towns, allowing customers to access a wider range of works for a small fee. Circulating libraries changed the atmosphere of private life. A woman could request a volume, receive it wrapped carefully, and carry it home beneath her cloak. The book might rest beside a candle in the evening while rain tapped against the window. She entered worlds of history, imagination, and distant places without leaving her chair. Some unmarried women also wrote creatively. They composed poems, moral essays, letters, and stories. Though many never published their work, publishing carried risks. A woman who appeared too ambitious could be criticized, while a woman who published anonymously might still fear discovery. Some writers used initials or male names to avoid judgment. Even household records reveal unexpected voices. Recipe books often contain more than instructions for food. Between formulas for cakes, medicines, and preserves, women sometimes added family births, deaths, weather notes, and personal memories. A page describing a remedy for cough might sit beside a record of a sister's marriage or a child's first steps. These books were working objects, handled with flour-covered fingers and stained by kitchen life. They were not created as historical treasures. They belonged to ordinary routines. A recipe might be adjusted after a failed attempt. A remedy might be crossed out. A note might be added years later by another woman continuing the same household tradition. For unmarried women, such writing could preserve identity. A woman who lacked a husband or children might still leave evidence of her thoughts, choices, and relationships. A niece might inherit her recipe book. A friend might keep her letters. A church might preserve her donations or records of service. Through these fragments, a life that seemed invisible becomes briefly visible. Night settled gently over the houses where these women wrote. The fire burned lower, candles shortened, and the sounds of the household faded. A pen moved slowly across paper while a clock marked the passing hour. Outside, wind crossed the fields and touched the walls of stone churches, while distant bells reminded everyone that another day was approaching. The written word could not remove loneliness or guarantee independence. It could not change the limits placed upon women by law and custom, but it offered something precious, a place where a woman's own voice could remain after the room had emptied, after the fire had cooled, and after generations had forgotten the sound of her footsteps. The lives of unmarried women were rarely lived in complete isolation. Even those who occupied small rooms, worked in private households, or earned their living alone remained connected through friendships, obligations, and quiet networks of support. These relationships often existed outside the official structures that historians usually find in records. They were preserved instead through shared work, repeated visits, exchanged gifts, and memories carried from one woman to another. In villages, female friendship often began with necessity. Women met at wells, washing areas, markets, church entrances, and garden paths. They helped one another lift heavy baskets, watched children for a short while, shared news, and exchanged advice about illness, cooking, and household problems. A woman who lived alone depended greatly on these small acts of kindness. A neighbour who brought a bowl of broth during sickness could matter as much as any formal arrangement. The village well was one of the great meeting places of daily life. Women arrived with buckets, pitchers, and wooden containers, sometimes waiting their turn while water was drawn from deep below. Conversations grew naturally in such moments. News travelled there faster than along any official route. A new marriage, a sudden death, a failed harvest, or the arrival of a stranger might be discussed before evening. For unmarried women, reputation was shaped partly through these gatherings. A woman who was helpful and cheerful might become well regarded. One who was constantly involved in disputes might find fewer willing hands when she needed assistance. Yet friendship was rarely simple. The same women who shared recipes and remedies might also exchange rumours. Community could provide comfort and pressure at the same time. Women who had once expected to marry sometimes formed especially close bonds with other unmarried women. They shared rooms, divided expenses, and created households that resembled family. Two sisters might remain together after their parents died. Two friends might rent a cottage and combine their labour. A widowed relative might join a younger unmarried woman, creating a household built not on marriage but on mutual dependence. These arrangements were practical. Rent, fuel, and food were expensive, and two incomes or two sets of skills could make survival easier. One woman might sew while another kept accounts. One might grow vegetables while another sold goods at market. Their home became a place where tasks were divided according to ability rather than traditional marital roles. Such households were not always officially recognised. A parish record might simply list several women at one address without explaining their relationship. Historians continue to debate how common these arrangements were, partly because ordinary cooperation rarely produced dramatic documents. Yet scattered evidence suggests that many women created forms of companionship that existed quietly beside marriage. Affection between women was expressed through ordinary objects. A friend might give another a handkerchief, a knitted item, a small religious token, or a pressed flower saved from a summer walk. When someone died, belongings were often distributed among those who had cared for her. A simple spoon, Bible, or piece of jewellery could carry years of shared memory. Funerals revealed the importance of these bonds. Women prepared the body, arranged clothing, carried food to the grieving household, and sat together during mourning. Death was a familiar presence in 18th-century communities. Illness, childbirth, accidents, and harsh winters meant that loss touched almost every family. The women who remained unmarried often became the ones who provided practical comfort during these moments. They washed linens after a death, cooked meals, watched children while parents grieved, and helped settle the belongings of the deceased. Such work was emotionally difficult but socially important. Their availability came partly from the assumption that they had fewer obligations, though that assumption often ignored the depth of their existing responsibilities. Friendship also formed through work. Female servants developed strong connections while sharing exhausting routines beneath the same roof. Two maids might whisper together after the family retired, exchanging hopes about better positions or future marriages. A housekeeper might guide a younger servant, teaching her skills that could improve her prospects. These relationships could last long after one woman left service. Market women created another network. Stallholders protected each other from theft, watched goods during brief absences, and warned newcomers about dishonest customers. A woman arriving alone in a town could survive partly because other traders recognized the difficulty of standing in public without family protection. Religious gatherings provided additional connections. Women met during worship, charitable activities, and visits to the sick. They contributed small amounts of money or clothing to help poorer neighbours. Some formed prayer groups where they read devotional works and discussed moral concerns. These gatherings offered companionship beyond the household and created a sense of purpose. Yet female friendships could also be judged. Society often praised women for devotion to family but was less comfortable with women creating independent communities. Two unmarried women sharing a home might be viewed as sensible or unusual depending on local attitudes. A woman who spent too much time outside her family's control could attract criticism. Even language reflected these uncertainties. A married woman was usually identified through her relationship to a husband. An unmarried woman might be described through occupation, family connection, or age. Without a husband's household, others sometimes struggled to define her position. She became the seamstress, the healer, the aunt, the schoolmistress, or simply the old maid near the church. But behind these labels were friendships that gave shape to daily existence. They were the people who knew where the spare key was hidden, which herb helped a cough, which family needed extra bread, and which grief remained unspoken. They carried each other through ordinary hardships that rarely appeared in official histories. As evening descended over the village, lights appeared one by one behind small windows. In one cottage, two women shared a simple meal beside the fire. In another, an older woman listened as a younger neighbour described her worries. Outside, a cart moved slowly along the muddy road, and the sound of wheels faded into the night. The world often measured women's lives by marriage, children, and inheritance. Yet many unmarried women measured their own lives differently. They remembered friendships, skills learned, kindness offered, and people who had stood beside them when circumstances were difficult. These connections formed an invisible architecture of support, stronger than stone walls and quieter than church bells. Long after houses changed hands and names faded from parish books, these relationships remained hidden beneath the surface of history. They remind us that a life without marriage was not a life without belonging. It was a life woven from countless threads of companionship, trust, and shared time. Time changed the shape of every life, and for unmarried women the passing years often brought new challenges. Youth, when work and possibility seemed plentiful, gradually gave way to middle age and then old age. Without a husband or children to provide expected support, some women faced uncertainty, yet many also discovered forms of stability built from reputation, skill, family connections, and the communities they had served for decades. Aging in the 18th century was not measured by numbers alone. A woman could become considered old earlier than we might expect today, especially if physical labour had worn down her body. Years of carrying water, standing over fires, washing linen, and working outdoors left marks. Hands became stiff, eyes weakened in candlelight, knees ached after climbing stairs or walking muddy lanes. For an unmarried woman who had spent her life working, the greatest concern was often not age itself but the loss of income. A seamstress whose eyesight failed could no longer sew as quickly. A market seller weakened by illness might struggle to lift baskets. A servant dismissed after many years might find that youth and strength were no longer enough to secure another position. Some women prepared for these years carefully. They saved coins hidden beneath floorboards, inside locked chests, or among folded clothing. They kept useful objects that could be sold if necessary: spare linen, silver spoons, tools, or household goods. Others relied on relatives, though family support was never guaranteed. A brother, niece, or cousin might welcome an unmarried woman into the household, but she could also become dependent on the kindness of people whose own circumstances were uncertain. The family home could change greatly over a lifetime. The cottage where a woman had grown up might pass to another generation. The manor where she served might belong to a new owner. The shop where she worked might close after a death or debt. Objects remained while people changed. A wooden table worn smooth by hands, a cracked bowl repaired many times, or a chest filled with old letters could hold memories of decades. Parish communities sometimes provided assistance. Poor relief systems existed to support those who could not survive alone. Though receiving help often required examination and approval, officials considered whether someone was truly unable to work, whether relatives should contribute, and whether the person belonged legally to that parish. The process could be humiliating. A woman who had spent her life serving others might now have to explain her needs before local authorities. The poorhouse or workhouse represented one possible destination for those without support. These institutions varied greatly. Some were harsh places where residents followed strict schedules of labour, prayer, and meals. Others offered a more organised form of shelter than the streets or overcrowded lodgings. Women might spin, sew, mend clothing, prepare food, or perform cleaning tasks in exchange for accommodation. Admission often carried social judgment. Poverty was sometimes viewed as a personal failure rather than the result of illness, economic change, or bad fortune. An unmarried elderly woman could be unfairly described as someone who had no family, even when she had spent her life caring for relatives and neighbours. Records rarely captured these invisible contributions. Charity offered another fragile support. Wealthy families donated coal, bread, blankets, or small payments to the poor, especially during winter. Churches collected offerings. Benevolent societies assisted widows, servants, and elderly women with good reputations. A woman known for honesty and devotion might receive help more easily than someone considered troublesome. Clothing itself could reveal dependence. Some charitable foundations provided distinctive gowns, cloaks, or badges to recipients. These items offered practical protection from cold while also identifying the wearer as someone receiving assistance. The garment carried both warmth and a visible reminder of hardship. Yet old age did not always mean helplessness. Many older unmarried women held important roles. Their experience made them valuable advisors. A grandmotherly neighbour might know every family connection in the village. An elderly healer might still be called upon for remedies and advice. A retired servant might become a trusted housekeeper because years of knowledge could not be easily replaced. Memory became one of their greatest possessions. They remembered which families had lived in which cottages, which fields flooded after heavy rain, which herbs grew near the old path, and which customs belonged to earlier generations. Younger people might laugh at old stories, but they often returned when they needed practical knowledge. Religious life also provided comfort. Older women attended church regularly, prayed for family members living and dead, and maintained rituals that had shaped their entire existence. They might light candles on feast days, visit roadside shrines, or leave flowers near graves. Some carried small devotional objects in their pockets, worn smooth from years of handling. Winter was often the hardest season. Fuel became precious, roads became difficult, and darkness arrived early. An elderly unmarried woman living alone had to plan carefully. A small fire needed constant attention. Food had to last until spring. Illness could arrive suddenly when travel was nearly impossible. On long evenings, memories filled the quiet. The sound of wind against shutters might bring thoughts of childhood winters, departed parents, old friends, and houses that no longer stood. A woman might open a chest and find a ribbon from a forgotten courtship, a letter from a distant relative, or a garment sewn decades earlier. No one can quite agree how many elderly unmarried women lived independently into old age, because records often focus only on those who required official assistance. Many likely remained within family networks or small communities. Their lives did not end when marriage failed to arrive. They adapted, shifted roles, and continued contributing where they could. The village at night remained much the same. Smoke rose from chimneys. A lantern moved slowly along the road. Rain touched the roof of a cottage where an old woman sat beside the fire, perhaps mending a cloth, reading a worn prayer book, or simply listening to the familiar sounds around her. The world that once measured her by the absence of a husband had changed. The young girls who passed her doorway knew her not as an unmarried woman, but as someone who remembered births, weddings, storms, and harvests. Her value existed in stories and relationships, even when official records barely noticed. In the quiet years of later life, many unmarried women became keepers of memory. They preserved recipes, family histories, local traditions, and small pieces of the disappearing world. Their footsteps grew slower, but their presence remained woven into the places they had known for so long. The stories of unmarried women in the 18th century rarely ended with grand announcements. There were no monuments raised for most of them, no portraits hanging in royal galleries, no chapters written in the histories of kings and battles. Their lives passed more quietly, carried forward through household accounts, parish records, worn letters, and the memories of those who knew them. Yet quiet does not mean insignificant. Across villages, towns, estates, and country roads, these women helped hold together the ordinary world. They spun the thread that became clothing, prepared the food that sustained households, tended the sick during uncertain nights, taught children their letters, managed shops, served in manor houses, and cared for relatives when others had gone away. Their work rarely appeared as remarkable because it was woven so deeply into everyday life. A woman who never married might still leave behind hundreds of small traces. Her handwriting might remain in an old recipe book. Her name might appear beside a donation to a church. A chest of linens might carry the initials she stitched into cloth decades earlier. A neighbour might remember the woman who arrived with herbs during a fever, or the aunt who always kept a candle burning for travellers returning late. History often preserves moments of change, wars, discoveries, royal marriages, and political struggles. But ordinary lives move differently. They unfold through repeated mornings, familiar paths, and small acts performed without expectation of recognition. The unmarried women of the 18th century lived within this quieter rhythm. Their world was shaped by stone churches, muddy roads, wooden doors, and the slow turning of seasons. In spring, they walked through fields searching for useful plants and watched gardens awaken after winter. In summer, they worked beneath long daylight, washing linen, gathering crops, selling goods, or caring for children. Autumn brought the preparation of food and fuel. Winter drew everyone closer to the hearth, where stories were shared beside flickering flames. The landscape itself became part of memory. A particular lane might recall a journey to market. A bridge might bring back the night a messenger arrived with news. A forest path might hold memories of gathering wood or herbs. A village bell might mark not only the passing hour, but also the births, deaths, marriages, and losses that shaped each generation. For unmarried women, time could feel both slow and swift. A young woman might once have waited for a proposal that never came. Years later, she might realize that the life she feared had already become the life she knew. The empty place society expected to be filled by marriage could become occupied instead by friendships, work, knowledge, and independence. Some regretted remaining unmarried, some were grateful. Some likely felt both emotions at different moments. Human lives rarely fit into a single explanation. A woman could miss the warmth of a husband's companionship while appreciating the ability to make her own choices. She could feel loneliness one evening and deep contentment the next morning while tending her garden or speaking with a trusted friend. Those who judged unmarried women often saw only what was missing. They saw the absent husband, the empty household, the lack of children. They did not always see the full collection of relationships surrounding her. They did not see the neighbour who depended on her advice, the children she helped raise, the patient she comforted, or the younger women who learned skills from her. The old roads between villages carried countless such stories. A woman walked them carrying a basket of eggs. Another travelled beneath a cloak to attend a birth. Another followed a servant's path toward a distant manor where she would spend years polishing silver and preparing meals. Another sat beside a window writing letters that would never become famous, but mattered deeply to the people who received them. No one can quite agree how many of these lives have disappeared completely from memory. Many women left behind only a name and a date. Others remain as faint shadows in documents written for different purposes. A tax record, a burial entry, a household inventory, or a court note may reveal only a few lines. Yet behind each line was a person who experienced hope, disappointment, affection, fear, humour, and ordinary moments of peace. The passage of time has a way of softening the sharp edges of old judgments. Words that once carried criticism can now be viewed differently. The woman called a spinster may also be remembered as a craftswoman, caregiver, business owner, teacher, healer, or guardian of tradition. Her story belongs not only to the past, but to the broader understanding of how people build meaningful lives within the limits of their world. The candlelight fades slowly. The manor rooms grow quiet. The market square is empty. The muddy roads rest beneath the moon. In distant fields, the last footsteps disappear, and the village settles beneath blankets of darkness. A small fire remains in a cottage hearth, glowing softly as another night passes. The bells of the stone church sound across the sleeping countryside, gentle and distant. They have marked countless hours before this one, and will continue long after the people who heard them are gone. Generations arrive, live their brief seasons, and pass away like leaves carried by autumn wind. The women of this story have returned to that quiet landscape now. They stand beside old doorways, walk forgotten paths, and rest beneath the same skies that watched over their lives. Their voices may be faint, but they are not completely lost. A recipe written in faded ink, a repaired piece of cloth, a name carved into a stone, a memory carried by another person. These small things remain like embers after a great fire has burned low. And as the night deepens, the 18th century world slowly disappears into the distance. The candles shorten, the halls become still, the roads empty, the fields sleep beneath the stars. Only the gentle rhythm of time remains,